Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about troubling and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and
why I don't trust the media, and why you should probably be skeptical of it as well. So the media, the news information industry, or some might say the news entertainment industry, is a business. They have a business model. They're in this game for profit of one form or another. And in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of good things come from people chasing the profit motive. Almost all the goods and services we enjoy came from somebody trying to make a buck. Unfortunately, sometimes there's perverse incentives in a market. And it's my thesis that these perverse incentives have corrupted a lot of the media. So in this video, I'm going to outline 3 of those perverse incentives and explain why I think they've made the media untrustworthy. First, let's define what I mean when I say the media. The media would be the whole gambit. Corporate news, think of like cable news, for example, CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Think of the more traditional networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. You can think of print media. Of course, all of them are online now, one form or another. Talk radio, throw state media in there as well, NPR. And I would even include my favorite source of media, which would be the alternative media, podcasters, independent journalists, things like those. Now, of all of them, I think the alternative media is more interesting. The internet, podcast, it's just a better forum for disseminating information for reasons I could get into later, but even though I like the alternative media, it still faces the same incentives. So that's what I mean when I say the media. My distrust of the media actually started at a very young age. My parents were self-employed. My dad had a small business and a few employees. I remember once a local TV station was doing a story on the industry that my father's business was in. And as part of this story, they decided they wanted to interview a local person that was engaged in that business. So they came into my dad's shop and interviewed one of his employees. Later, this interview, part of it aired on their news channel later. And as a child, I remember seeing this. I was maybe 10, give or take a few years. I remember watching this, and as they were airing this interview, the chyron underneath misidentified the employee as the owner, which obviously I knew was wrong. It was my parents that owned this business. The person they were interviewing was just a manager there. And it wasn't a critical point to the story, but it was just something that I noticed that they got wrong. And I remember thinking, these people are journalists, they're reporters. Their whole job is to verify facts and report things accurately, and yet they missed this simple detail. And like I said, it wasn't critical to the story, but it's just something I picked up on. As a kid, I was very interested in social studies, politics, history, economics, things like that. Social studies was my favorite class in school, so political things always interested me. So as a teenager, remember sometime around the time I was a teenager, my parents got cable, so we had cable news, CNN. I'm not sure if Fox was out then or not, but it came shortly after. I remember watching the cable news networks and the sort of the political analyst shows like Crossfire, where they'd have a couple of people, sometimes 3 or 4 people of different perspectives, and they'd debate, if you want to call it that. And it was interesting for a while. I like to see the clash of ideas and people work things out. I soon began to realize it was just superficial and never really led anywhere. Like, it would just be, they'd cover a topic for a few minutes. By cover, I mean, you'd have one guy arguing this position, another guy arguing a different position. They'd just be talking over each other. They'd interrupt each other all the time. And they really wouldn't get into depth or detail. They just shout talking points at one another. Then they'd go to a commercial break. And when they came back, they'd start talking about something else. And it just felt like a total waste of time. Like, it was agitating and lacked any depth. It was almost as bad as watching Jerry Springer, just people shouting over each other. So later in my teenage years, I would start to listen to talk radio, because on talk radio, at least, you'd have a 2 or 3 hour show, and they'd talk an issue out, and they'd take callers, so it was a little more interactive, or you could have people call in and maybe challenge what the host was saying, give different perspectives. And it was a little bit better than a cable news show, but I noticed deficits there as well. Not to mention, some shows were just terrible. They were just like 2 or 3 hours, ton of commercial breaks, and in between commercial breaks, it was like as slow as possible. Like, it's like the host had a limited amount of things to say, and he had to fit it into a 2-hour time block, so he would just drag things out and take forever to make his point. So now I mostly get my information from the alternative media. I just think online is a better platform than television, radio. It's a little more interactive and easier for me to consume than a lot of print. I don't have time to sit down and read a lot, so if I can listen to a podcast or listen to a speaker online talk about a topic, it's much easier for me to consume. It doesn't have the same constraints as, say, radio, where you got to fill a 2-hour time block and you got to find something to talk about, or you got to drag your topic out as long as possible. Or the other extreme, like television, where you only got 5 minutes to talk about something, and then you got to go to a commercial break, and then you got to cover the next topic. So it's like the best of both worlds. You can take as much time as you need, say on a podcast, to hash a topic out, and you don't have to fill it full of filler because you got to fill a 3-hour show every day. That said, all these forms face the perverse incentives that I'm going to talk about in the rest of this video. The incentive to sensationalize. In many ways, the universe seems to be very fractal. If you zoom in close and find a pattern, a lot of times that pattern seems to repeat, and as you step back further and further and further, this pattern seems to repeat on larger and larger scales. Now, the micro doesn't always perfectly extrapolate to the macro, but the orbit of, say, electrons around a nucleus of an atom doesn't seem too unlike the orbit of planets around stars, or stars around the center of a galaxy. And I think the same is true often in the human world. Studying behaviors on a smaller scale, say the behaviors of an individual, can help you understand why humans behave in ways on a corporate scale, on a larger scale. So I have a friend, and I'm willing to bet anyone who's lived for any length of time has probably known somebody like this. My friend likes to tell stories, and he also likes to exaggerate a lot in the stories that he likes to tell. I know this because him and I have been witnesses to the exact same event, and then I've heard him recant the same story to other people, and I've seen how much the details change. A lot of times the event was fairly mundane, not really exciting, but when he recants it, it suddenly takes on a whole different light, a whole different tone. Relatively calm conversations get turned into heated arguments in his version of the story. Emotions get turned way up. Conversations that he's recanting, instead of being relatively civil, are now full of profanities and thinly veiled threats, and the excitement level of the story that he tells doesn't really match the actual event. It's like he took the story, put it through a funny mirror, and now it's completely distorted. Now, why precisely does my friend behave this way? I can only speculate as to his inner motivations, but my suspicion is that he likes to hear himself talk, and he likes to be the center of attention. And the way to get the spotlight is to tell a wild, crazy story. And if you don't have one, well, then you make one up, and that's what he seems to do. You take something that's sort of based in reality. Like his stories do have some link to what actually happened, but they're heavily embellished. And to some extent, I mean, it is a successful strategy. If you're telling crazy stories, you're more likely to catch people's attention. However, it only works until people realize that you're full of it, and then you lose credibility and nobody takes you seriously anymore. So how does this pattern relate to the media? Well, the media, again, wants to grab your attention. Their business model is built around capturing an audience and monetizing them in some way. You know, if it's an online story, they want a catchy headline that's going to get you to click on that, and then once you're reading the article, you're going to get bombarded with ads. If it's television, they need to get you to tune in so that they can sell time to advertisers during the commercial breaks. Same thing with radio, same thing with podcasts. They need an ever-flowing stream of compelling stories to capture their audience so that they can continue to monetize them. You know, when your livelihood depends on it, there's an awful big incentive to try to find those compelling stories. If the story isn't compelling enough, sometimes you gotta make it compelling. The media industry has a long history of engaging in this type of behavior. In fact, we have a term for it. It's called yellow journalism. At least that's what it was called in the past. Nowadays it might be called fake news, but same concept. This phenomenon has been observed as long as we have been a country. One of my favorite Thomas Jefferson quotes reads, "The man who never looks at a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them. Insomuch as he knows nothing, he is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors." And I have to say, in my time, I've made similar observations. I've known people that consume way too much low-quality news, and on this steady diet of hype and sensationalism, they're not only constantly in a state of agitation, constantly worked up about something. Most of what they're worked up about isn't even real, or it's an exaggeration. Now I could probably make this video hours and hours long if I was to go through every example I could think of that where the news media sensationalized a story. But for brevity's sake, I'm just going to focus on one example. And it's an example from contemporary history that most people are going to have heard of. I also like this example because it's going to be a good segue into the next perverse incentive that I'm going to talk about, which is audience capture, or the incentive to play to an audience. So let's talk about January 6th, 2021. Now, how would I describe what happened on January 6th? Well, there was a protest. I'm just going straight on verifiable facts. Definitely was a protest. There's videographic evidence of that. Mixed in with this protest was some bad actors that engaged in what you might call riotous behavior. There was scuffles between these actors and the police, might call a brawl, and there was property damage. So to borrow a term from CNN, you might say it was a mostly peaceful protest, though in this instance they certainly wouldn't have characterized it that way. But most people that were there were simply protesting, demonstrating. And the bad actors that behaved in riotous behavior should be charged with those crimes. You know, if you assault a police officer, well, you should be charged with assault. If you commit property crime, you should be charged with property crimes. Now, how many people died during the Jan 6th protests / insurrection, depending on who you're listening to? Well, one woman was shot by Capitol Police and died of her injuries. One person died of an apparent drug overdose. 2 other people died of natural causes. One Capitol Police officer died during the incident, was involved in some of the scuffles with rioters, but his death was later ruled to be natural. Died of strokes, I believe. Now that's how somebody like me, just a casual observer, just looking at the facts, would describe what happened on January 6th. How did many news outlets describe January 6th? Well, some of them described it as an armed insurrection. Really? Did the people have guns? How many people had guns during the January 6th insurrection? Others in the media described the events of January 6th as the worst assault on American democracy since 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. Now, some might call that an irresponsible use of hyperbole. But the events of January 6th did not happen in a vacuum. In fact, the previous 9 months, starting around May of 2020, were marked by protests and riots of a different kind. Following the death of George Floyd, there was protests that devolved into riots in Minneapolis and many other cities across the country. New York, Seattle, Portland, urban areas everywhere, people were protesting, and many of those turned into riots. It turned into looting, turned into property damage, assaults on police officers. And during the summer of 2020, almost every time there was a police shooting, whether justified or not, involving an African American, there was soon to follow a protest, and usually those turned into more riots. Now, during these events, dozens of people died. Hundreds, maybe thousands of officers were assaulted. Police precincts were burnt down. Businesses were torched. Businesses were looted. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bystanders were assaulted during these riots. Billions of dollars worth of property damage. And in fairness, a lot of the people that were out protesting were doing it peacefully. However, just like on Jan 6th, there was a lot of bad actors engaging in criminal activity. And in terms of scale, they did a lot more damage than the bad actors on January 6th. Just a lot more people involved, many different cities affected. A lot more damage was done during the so-called Summer of Love, as it was satirically dubbed. And that's not just my opinion. There was clearly a lot more tangible damage done, a lot more assaults, a lot more people injured and killed, a lot more property damage than what happened on January 6th. However, one was characterized as a fiery, but mostly peaceful protest, and the other was portrayed as a insurrection, an assault on democracy, worse than 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, at least comparable to. I mean, it's not the first time in America that people protested the result of an election, and it's certainly not the first time that some of those protests turned into riots. In fact, I'm pretty sure there was protests after the 2016 election, and I'm pretty sure there was riots after the 2016 election when people didn't want to accept the result. But I don't recall some of the same media outlets that called January 6th an insurrection calling the riots after 2016 insurrections. Why the difference? Why the difference in the way they color these stories? Well, that's my lead into the next perverse incentive I want to talk about: playing to the audience, telling your audience what you think they want to hear. So in the previous section, we talked about the perverse incentive to sensationalize the story, to hype it up, to make it sexier than it otherwise would be. In this section, we're going to talk about the perverse incentive to play to the audience, to become captured by an audience, and the incentive to just feed that audience what you think they want to hear, rather than be an objective source of information to the extent that we can be. I don't think it's possible for a human with limited knowledge to ever be entirely objective. We're not gods. But it's a goal to strive for. It's a target to aim at. And you can tell when somebody is trying to be objective, when they're trying to, get to their conclusion with a minimal amount of assumptions. And the reasoning is based heavily on verifiable facts. And you can tell when people aren't doing that. You can tell when people are throwing in a bunch of assumptions, cherry picking which facts they want to emphasize and which facts they want to de-emphasize. Well, I think it's impossible to be perfectly objective. It's easy to spot who's trying and who's not. One of the things George Washington warned about in his farewell address was the dangers of partisanship, the spirit of partisanship, and I'm paraphrasing. He saw and anticipated how it could tear the country apart. The tribal sort of loyalty to a political party brings out the worst in men's natures. It can warp their ability to think clearly, it can warp their moral judgments, and it can turn men into hypocrites. I think it is apparent that partisanship can corrupt the minds and moral judgments of men. So I can see how a morally corrupt person, someone who's corrupted by the spirit of partisanship, I can see them making excuses for terrible behavior when it's done by a group whose cause they're sympathetic to. I can see them being more lenient with that that group when they're engaging in, say, back to our Jan 6th / Summer of Love example, I could see them making excuses for rioting and looting and assaulting police officers when they think the cause is just, and then without blinking, harshly and severely condemning that behavior when it's perpetrated by a group of people whose cause they're not sympathetic to. So think of Kamala Harris raising money to help bail out the people that were arrested during BLM riots versus how she would treat, somebody arrested during the Jan 6 riots. One case will bend over backwards to make excuses for the people behaving in terrible behavior. And the other case will treat you as a treasonous insurrectionist for merely being present. Which, by the way, is no small thing. If half the country believes that we have a two-tiered justice system and you're treated totally different before the law, depending on your politics, that is the recipe for the collapse of the system. Now, all that aside, I can see why a partisan would do that, and that's why I think partisanship warps the morality of men. However, journalists are supposed to be better than this. They're supposed to be aiming for that target of objectivity. I mean, if you went to journalism school, you went to college and studied principles and ethics of being a journalist, and then you went out and got hired on by a company whose job it is to be engaged in that business of journalism. I mean, you should be a very well-grounded person in this profession. And the company you work for should have all sorts of checks and balances to help make sure that everybody's being as objective as possible. And if you're not doing that, and the company that you work for is not doing that, are you really a journalist at that point? Or are you just playing one on TV or in print or on the radio or whatever your medium is? Are you the journalistic equivalent of a quack doctor? Somebody who's corrupt and incompetent, but they're just trying to make a buck. They're not really trying to do what's in the best interest of their patient. They're just trying to sell them a particular treatment or in some way milk them out for all they're worth. And that's where I'm sort of leading to when I talk about playing to the audience. I have a friend who I'm going to label the political guy. And just like my friend the talebearer, if you live long enough, you probably know a political guy or two. A guy who just has an unhealthy obsession with politics. And some people that know me might even label me as the political guy. So I can kind of relate to him because I have deep interest in politics. Now, I like to think that I'm a more chill political guy and I'm fairly well adjusted. For the most part, I enjoy engaging in political discussions. But on an intellectual level, on an analytical level, I like to look at different ideas and look at the evidence and sort of weigh different policies against one another and try to wrestle my way to a better understanding of reality and a version that's closer to the truth. But some political guys are not that well adjusted. Some of them are heavily emotionally invested in a political ideology, and they seem to be in a constant state of agitation, which I don't think ultimately is healthy for them or productive. So my friend, the political guy, is that way. He looks at his side, the party he identifies with rose-colored glasses, overlooks their transgressions, and then he takes a microscope to the other side, the people that he doesn't align with politically. To borrow from the New Testament, he's a classic example of straining at a gnat and swallowing the camel. Beholding the sliver in his brother's eye, but not perceiving the log that's wedged into his own eye. And he's constantly agitated about politics, probably because he consumes way too much of the junk news that I'm criticizing in this video. It's certainly not helping the matter, but my friend is basically written off half the country. He thinks half the country is stupid and evil and racist. And he thinks the country would be much better off if these people just didn't exist, or, second from that, they were just subjugated, just forced to do what he thinks they should do. And he would seem to be perfectly comfortable with the state just forcing his views on the half of the country that doesn't agree with him. Now, my friend is an actual individual. There is a person I'm thinking of when I'm describing this person, but they could just as easily be an amalgamation of millions of people. There's millions of people that are of the same political persuasion as my friend and who basically think the same way. And my friend has a counterpart because there's millions of people that are basically the mirror image of my friend on the other side. They have the opposite view on politics, identify with the other party, and think the same thing in reverse. They think they're the moral, just people, the smart people, the good people on the right side of history, and the people on the other side are the crazy, evil, stupid people that we would all be better off if they didn't exist. And since we can't wish them all into the cornfield, we'd be better off if they were just subjugated and forced to go along with what they think is the best way of doing things. Now, my friend likes to poke the bear and engage in political discussions. If you would call it a discussion, mostly it's just him hurling partisan talking points and wild accusations at the people that he disagrees with in politics and their supporters, the people that live in the countryside and have a different political bent than he does. And I don't have any ill will towards this guy. I mean, on a human level, he's a decent person. But on the subject of politics, he's kind of a raving lunatic. So how do I engage with this person? Well, for the most part, I try to avoid political discussions with them because they're unfruitful. I'm going to calmly state my views and the reasons why I think them, and he's going to get all worked up and rant and rave and throw insults and ad hominems and make terrible arguments and hurl them at the people that he disagrees with. I'm not really his therapist. It's not my job to sort through all the BS and all the contradictions that are bouncing around in his gray matter. If I do engage with him on the discussion of politics, I'm very careful to just try to carefully point things out that I think might get him to open his mind a little bit. He'll be ranting and raving, and I'll say, well, okay, but what about this little fact that doesn't seem to fit so neatly into your worldview? Where does that fit in? And I'll sort of observe to see if he really considers it, or if he just dismisses it outright, or if he just changes the subject and starts ranting about the next thing. I guess my goal with this person is just to try to see if I can get them to see that there are reasonable people outside of his echo chamber that have different viewpoints and have good reasons for holding those viewpoints. Maybe just pull him back from the edge a little bit. Because like I said, I have no ill will towards this person. Consider him a friend. But let's say I wasn't his friend. Let's say I saw him as less of a friend, less of a human even, and more of a commodity to be exploited for my own purposes. And I thought to myself, how can I take all this guy's energy and how can I use his distorted view of reality to my advantage so I can profit from it? Well, instead of trying to get him to think, and instead of trying to pull him out of his echo chamber and see that the world is a little bit bigger than his worldview is accounting for, I could take the opposite approach. I could just hold my tongue when I see him completely misstating reality, and I could not throw out those data points and that evidence that might moderate his view slightly. I could just, basically tell him what he wants to hear. And then when he gets all worked up, I could pretend to get worked up right along with him. Yeah, those other people, they're terrible. We should use the state to just force them to go along with our point of view. Then he's going to see me as a fellow traveler. He's going to say, yeah, Fletch, that guy really gets it. And he's going to have a more favorable opinion of me because I confirm his biases for him. I make him feel fuzzy and comfortable. I tell him that, he's one of the good guys. He's on the right side of history. And I denigrate his enemies for him, or his perceived enemies. Yeah, those people over there that you don't like. Not only are they as bad as you think they are, but they're worse. Hey, look at this story. Look what I saw this guy saying. And I can start feeding him a bunch of negative stories about the people that he's already inclined to dislike. Rather than ever play devil's advocate or try to get him to consider another point of view, I'll just constantly reinforce what he already thinks. Now, why would I do this? Well, because it'll make him really comfortable around me. He'll seek me out and want to come over to talk to me and vent his frustrations, and I can stir the pot and tell him he's right and the other people are all wrong, and give him a, hey, that-a-boy, keep up the good fight. And then his guard will be down around me, and when I need something from him, or I want to take advantage of him in some way, he's more apt to trust me. Now, thankfully for my friend's sake, I'm not a Machiavellian asshole. But I think that other people are, particularly people in the news entertainment industry. And that's why professional journalists who should know better, and businesses that are supposedly engaged in the business of journalism, many of them will color stories a certain way in order to play to their audience. To basically do what I was just describing to my friend on a larger scale. Playing to the audience, telling them what they want to hear, coloring stories a certain way, emphasizing some facts that support the narrative that the audience already believes, and de-emphasizing facts that would start to poke holes in their echo chamber. And the reason they would do something like this is very similar to the reason that they would sensationalize a story, hype it up and make it more of a story than it otherwise would be. Because it's going to keep that audience coming back. And then they can monetize that audience. This is, for example, why some networks had nothing but negative stories about Trump for 4 years. Now, no public figure is above reproach, and they all deserve to be criticized and have their words and actions scrutinized because they're in a position of public trust. However, am I to believe that everything he said and did was wrong for 4 years? Likewise, in the other camp. Am I to believe that nothing the progressives ever do is justified or warranted, or at least they have good arguments for why they pursue a certain policy? So to summarize, that's the second perverse incentive I think media faces in today's market. And really, it's always faced that perverse incentive. There's been newspapers that favor one perspective over another, going back to the founding of the country, and no doubt before that. A notable difference, I would say, is that we're in the information age and information moves a lot faster. So instead of, getting worked up once a month when you read the paper, now you can go online or turn on your TV and get all worked up and bent out of shape about stuff on a daily basis. All day long, even if you want to. I mean, we have the 24-hour news channels now. So they can constantly be reinforcing your biases, and they can constantly be demonizing the people that you don't agree with. And they can sell you lots and lots of stuff during the advertisements. So to close up this section, a question I might ask the audience is that healthy? Is it good for people's mental, physical, spiritual health to be consuming that kind of hyper-partisan content on a regular basis? Or is it the news entertainment industry equivalent of going to McDonald's for your 3 square meals a day? Is it making somebody else rich to the detriment of your own well-being? People often think of like Fox News as a competitor to CNN or MSNBC. Well, are they really competing for the same thing? I mean, one is selling a product catered to a conservative audience, and one is selling a product catered to a progressive audience. And they play off of one another and criticize each other, but how much of a competition are they really in? I mean, do you honestly think a conservative is going to watch Rachel Maddow, for instance, and be converted? Think, oh yeah, she makes a really good point there. Or are they going to see her as the raving partisan lunatic that she probably is? Or think of Glenn Beck when he used to be on Fox during the Obama administration. Do you think any progressives tuned into Fox and listened to Glenn Beck and thought, wow, I'm going to have to rethink my whole worldview now. This guy really challenged my assumptions? Or did they simply dismiss him as a raving lunatic? But you know who does tune into Rachel Maddow every day to get their talking points from is partisans on one side of the aisle. And you know who does or did tune into Glenn Beck back in the day was partisans on the other side. So are they genuine people doing good journalism, or are they entertainers just placating an audience? And that's something thinking adults have to work out for themselves, but my point is to be skeptical of the people in the media, even and especially the people that you tend to agree with. Because even if they are genuine and this is not just a game to them, something they do to make a living, even if they genuinely believe the things that they're telling you, well, they're still just going to reinforce your biases because they share the same perspective that you do. Intellectual growth often comes from having an engaging conversation, or at least listening to people with different perspectives than your own. People that are genuine, however, that are reasonable and making good faith arguments. But my challenge to the viewer would be to be skeptical. Try to sift out who's being genuine and who's honestly presenting their point of view, and who's simply just saying things to placate an audience.
Brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Conflicts of interest. So the last perverse incentive I want to talk about that I believe corrupts media is conflicts of interest. You know, in the first section, I picked on my friend, the talebearer, the guy that likes to sensationalize. In the second section, I picked on my friend, the political guy, whose mind is warped by partisanship, I think. In this section, I'll pick on myself a little bit. By doing what I do as a content creator, making these videos, uploading them to YouTube and Rumble, I open myself up to these same sort of conflicts. I'm essentially producing media. Now, I don't face any real deep conflicts of interest because right now my channel's tiny. Nobody really wants to pay to advertise on my programming. They're not paying me anyway. My channel isn't large enough to monetize on YouTube. So if ads play during this video, it has nothing to do with me and I'm not getting any money for it. But on a side note, I still have an interest in my channel growing. So I face some of the same perverse incentives I was talking about earlier in this video. My whole point with this video is to get people to think and be skeptical of media. And I'm certainly not going to exclude myself from that equation. You should be skeptical of the things I'm saying. I have an incentive to exaggerate to get attention. So you should ask yourself, am I overstating the problem of sensationalism in the media? Am I sensationalizing the problem of sensationalism in the media just to get clicks? Now, I don't think that I am. I think I'm giving a pretty accurate view of the problems in the media, but you should have a healthy skepticism of any media that you're consuming. You should never assume the guy feeding you information isn't corrupt and or incompetent. Even if I have no ill will at all, I still could just be incompetent. I could be not knowing what I'm talking about. But let's talk about some potential conflicts of interest that could color the way I report on something. Let's say my channel did grow and I got a large enough audience where people that wanted to advertise were actually interested in paying for ads on my content, or paying me to do product placements, or to review and do a video on their product. Well, when you're getting paid to help sell something, you have an incentive to put it in the best light possible. Tell everybody the reasons why they should be consuming this product, and sort of step over and ignore all the reasons why this product maybe isn't the best thing for them. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, I listen to a lot of content creators that talk about health and nutrition. And they like to promote various products. And right now, one of those products that's fairly trendy is these electrolyte drinks. And I don't think that they're bad for you, I just don't think they're a good deal. There's cheaper ways to get your electrolytes that you don't have to pay through the nose for, because basically they're just taking elements that are abundant and cheap, putting in some flavor, and then doing some fancy marketing and getting people to pay way more for their electrolytes than they actually need to. Your electrolytes are salt, potassium, and in smaller quantities, magnesium. I mean, you can replenish a lot of electrolytes by simply eating a bag of potato chips because they're loaded in salt and potatoes are high in potassium. You might not want all the calories that come along with potato chips, but my point is, the salt is cheap and abundant. Sources of potassium are cheap and abundant. You don't need to pay through the nose for somebody's electrolyte water. But let's say my channel grew and I got large enough where advertisers were actually interested in me. And one of these companies that makes electrolyte drinks decided to sponsor my channel. And they're gonna pay me to, put a little product placement in and talk up their product a little bit. My temptation is to just go along with it. Oh yeah, this electrolyte water, it's so easy to get your electrolytes, it tastes so great. Reality, I believe they're kind of a rip-off, but I'm not going to say that if they're paying me to promote their product, or at least my temptation is not to say that. And on the front end, when you're first getting into this, it's really easy to say, oh, I'm never going to sell out, I'm always going to shoot straight and just tell people what I truly believe. And it's easy to say that from the start, but once you've invested hours and hours and hours into creating content and you're finally starting to see some returns, it's hard to turn up your nose at them, and it's very easy just to go with the flow and make a quick buck, even if it means promoting something that you truly don't believe in. So you might be wondering, so big deal, so some modestly successful YouTubers and influencers might be tempted to promote products that are overpriced from time to time. But what if we look at the larger news outlets where millions of people are tuning in? Say the corporate media, cable news, and established papers of record, you might say. Well, they've got advertisers too, and some of their advertisers are gargantuan. We're talking major international corporations with market caps in the billions, possibly even trillions. And they've got a lot of money to spend to try to get favorable press for their products and services. So I'm going to make up a totally hypothetical scenario here. Let's say that at some point, maybe some point in the future, there's a pandemic. From the first two examples, we could see that the media might have an incentive to overhype the story about the pandemic. I mean, don't get me wrong, the pandemic might be bad, but they have an incentive to make it seem worse than it actually is, which is not good, because if people aren't getting an accurate representation of the danger, they're potentially going to overreact to it and cause more problems than the pandemic would have created in and of itself. They also have a temptation to polarize the issue, play to the audience. You're the good person who's taking the pandemic really, really seriously, unlike that whack job down the street that isn't taking the same precautions you are. I mean, here you are, locked yourself in a closet with a can of Lysol, and he's out there on the beach, breathing fresh air, unfiltered by a piece of cloth. I mean, that can't be healthy, right? And let's say in this hypothetical pandemic, all the mitigation efforts tend to be just temporal anyway, because it seems like no matter what people do, everyone ends up getting the bug. Now, thankfully, there seems to be a number of therapeutics that none of which prevent infection or transmission of this hypothetical pandemic, but they at least help reduce the symptoms. If they're taken at the right time, there is evidence that it can help reduce symptoms. Now, let's say some of these treatment options are actually repurposed drugs that have patents that have long expired, and they're actually really cheap, readily available, easy to produce. But then there's other therapeutics that may or may not have been marketed as vaccines in this hypothetical scenario, that are brand new and are under patent, and pharmaceutical manufacturers charge through the nose for. Now, let's say some of these pharmaceutical companies that manufacture this particular therapeutic have deep pockets and pay through the nose for advertising, to the point of $2.8 billion a year, hypothetically. And they advertise on all these major corporate news networks. Can those networks be trusted to report accurately on this particular therapeutic? Can they be trusted not to denigrate the cheaper treatment options and not to hype the more expensive treatment option? Could they be trusted not to overstate the benefits and understate the potential risks? Well, if you ever find yourself in that situation, I'm not telling you what you should believe. I'm just trying to remind people to stay skeptical. Consider the incentive structure that influences these media companies. Try to independently verify the information.
Okay, picking it up here in Wilmington, North Carolina, right at the Intracoastal, and we're in one of these bands.
So that's Mike Seidel in Wilmington, North Carolina. But as he braces and fights the win Friday, check out the two guys who seem to walk right by him in the background there with no trouble at all. The video has been shared more than 1 million times on social media. So now a spokesperson for the Weather Channel is defending Seidel, saying it's important to note that the two individuals in the background are...
It's nice to rant and rave about how dark and corrupt the world can be, but there is cause for optimism. Let's assume I'm correct in my assessment of the media, the perverse incentives it faces, and let's say the media is really as bad as I suspect it is. There's still reason for optimism. There's things we can do to fix this problem. And the reason there's something we can do about it is because we are part of the problem. As news information consumers, we contribute to this problem. Because we're the gullible ones. We want to believe the sensational headline. We like it when that guy plays to the audience and tells us what we want to hear. We remain oblivious to the conflicts of interest at play, and don't even consider them. If enough of us developed a healthy skepticism, we could change the market. Let me draw on another example. We can all agree that fast food isn't the healthiest thing in the world. But it's super easy and it tastes good. That's why these businesses thrive. So if you're wondering why there's a McDonald's on every other street corner, along with probably half a dozen other fast food places, it's because of the guy in the mirror, because you choose to go buy their product. Now you could make healthier choices. And instead of that money going to McDonald's, it would go to a company that's making a healthier alternative. And if enough people did that, they would start to change the market, because these companies are chasing the profit motive. If they can no longer make a buck selling you cheap fried food that isn't good for you, after they have a few bad quarters where sales are way down, they're going to start to do something else. They're going to try to play to the market. They're going to try to produce something that's healthier that the market actually wants to consume now. And as a news information consumer, you can do the same thing to the media industry. You can demand better quality stuff. And mainly you do that by turning your back on the crap and turning towards better sources. And I'm not going to sort all that out for you in this video. I mean, you got to figure out for yourself who you want to listen to. My point is just you need to develop a healthy skepticism. You need to consider the perverse incentives. You need to consider the conflicts of interest. You need to do your homework and find more reliable sources of information. And in doing so, if enough people do that, the lousy producers of news information will start to go out of business. They'll at least lose market share, and the better ones will gain market share. You know, to borrow from the New Testament, don't cast your pearls before swine. You know, don't give something valuable. Don't give your attention to people who aren't worthy of it. I have a family member, for example, that absolutely hates the show The View, but she always tunes into it and watches it. And I've talked to her about it. It's like, why are you... They only care that you're paying attention to them. They don't care whether you hate them or not. If you tune in, you're helping boost their ratings, and you're helping to keep them around. If nobody watched The View, it would be canceled. Now, when it comes to these different news channels, if they're not doing a good job, tune them out. It'll force them to either, if they lose enough viewers, they'll be forced to either go out of business or change their business model and start producing better news information. You know, if you want a healthier body, make healthier choices with the food that you eat. Make healthier lifestyle choices. And I would say if you want a healthier mind, make better choices with the information you consume. And I would say that with information, it not only affects your mental health, your state of mind, it not only affects your worldview, it also affects your physical health. Because if you're watching stuff that's designed to get you all worked up, that's going to start affecting your physical health as well. It's going to affect your emotional health. So that'll be my conclusion. Do your part to be a better information consumer. You've been watching the Fletch Report. If you're hearing this, it means you've made it to the end of the video. But before you click onto the next thing and continue down whatever rabbit hole you're on YouTube or Rumble, I've got a small favor to ask. If you found value in my content and you want to help the channel out, the best thing you can do is share it with somebody else that you think will find value in it. Don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe if you want to see more. Links to the channel on YouTube and Rumble will be provided below. Additionally, I'm making a Facebook page for the channel as well as a X/formerly Twitter. Feel free to follow me on those platforms as well. If you're feeling exceptionally generous, Provided in the description below will be a link to Buy Me a Coffee, which is the online equivalent of a tip jar. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting the channel.